Hello, and today on Meaning Podcast, Tamir Dortal is hosting the legendary Professor Russ Roberts, the founder of EconTalk, the best podcast I know about economics in English. And today we have been talking about economics, and in particular about Israeli economics, and why our housing prices in Israel are rising and rising, and there is no hope for the next generation. Enjoy.
על המשמעות, פודקאסט פילוסופי פוליטי.
Shalom, Professor Roberts.
Shalom.
So today we are going to talk about your main expertise about economics. You've been teaching economics for more than 30 years and wrote many books and essays. Let's start talking about why is people's intuition about economics, about what they know, what they think economics is, and how this field operates, is so wrong if you compare it to the models, if you compare it to people who actually studied the subject and its consequences in the real world.
Economics is very challenging. It can be taught in many different ways. It's frequently taught in as a form of applied mathematics, which I think is unfortunate. It's not necessarily the most useful way to think about economics, especially for someone who's not planning to go to graduate school, someone who takes one economics class or majors in economics and then goes on to do something else. I think the mathematical approach is not quite so helpful to them in terms of giving them a lens for understanding the world. The fundamental concepts of economics, to me, are how markets work, and that's a tricky phrase. I said it like it's no big deal, how markets work. And I think when people hear that phrase, they think, oh, markets, that's like the stock market, or it might be like a farmer's market, or the shuk, or something from day-to-day life. But the idea of a market to an economist is a very abstract concept. It's a way of trying to organize your thinking about the fact that what happens in the real world is a very complex interaction between buyers and sellers. And from that interaction, prices emerge. It looks like sellers set prices. And in some sense, they do. They write the numbers down on the product that they're charging. But if you write a number down that doesn't make sense, that's very different from the market price, the price that's pretty much available everywhere else, you're not going to sell as much, or you may sell too much. You may find yourself losing money or having many. So if you set, let me say it differently. If you set a price that's too high, that's much higher than other people are charging, you're free to write that price down and hope that someone will pay it. But if those people shop around, they will probably not buy your product. You're free to set a price that's very low. If you do that, people will suddenly realize that not suddenly, they'll find out ideally that your product is priced in very low, and they'll buy all of your stuff, and you'll realize, oh, I could have gotten more. So the price you write down is not necessarily the price that's going to be the price that works. And I think what a market is about, and the way the economists think about markets, is how to think about how those prices come into being, how people write down what they actually write down as the price is driven not just by what the seller wants or would like, but what is being charged by all the different sellers for different qualities of the good. And that is a very mysterious and unintuitive idea, and most people struggle to understand it quickly. They have to experience that intuition again and again and again.
They have to play the game.
Yeah.
They have to play the bread game.
Yeah,
we have to say to our audience that you were a teacher of mine in a course of economics that was being taught at the Tikva Fund a few years ago, and you've made few really good games of the way to teach economics and the economics economic principles to the public without lecturing it, but to feel it in your hands.
Experience. Yeah, that particular game, the bread game, actually came from my co-teacher, Debbie Henney, who's a phenomenal teacher. I wrote a poem about it. That poem I tried to write. You can find it online. It's at wonderfulloaf.org, wonderfulloaf.org. That poem and the illustration, the animation behind it is an attempt to give a non-economist, a normal human being, the flavor of how markets work and the complexity that underlies them. So I started talking about what's at the root of the economic way of thinking. Certainly it's about markets, which is an example of what scientists call complexity. I don't think economics is a science. I think it's at best a social science, which is not very scientific, but it's a way of looking at the world. And complexity is present in economic activity, like prices of various goods that emerge through this complicated interaction between buyers and sellers. It also, of course, is in the natural world in all kinds of forms, in biology and in physics. But the essence of recognizing complexity is the idea that things are connected. So if you change one thing, other things will change. And I know you remember, because you told me before we started, that one of the things you remember from when we were together as teacher and student is this idea of Ivrit azma. Then what? It's one thing to say, well, let's do this and this will happen. But then the economist asks the next question, but then what? What comes next? What forces have been set in motion by the change that you put in place that you want to take account of? And when you don't take account of them, you get an important thing called the law of unintended consequences, things that happen because you could not foresee the underlying complexity of the situation. So economics is about understanding markets, which is about complexity. It's also about incentives, how people respond to changes in the rules of the game, the things that that surround them, the prices they face, or the legislation that's in place, what we would call the rules of the game. So it's about incentives, it's about markets, and it's also about cost. Cost, we think we understand. Cost is what you pay for something, but of course what you pay isn't just money. It's often time. It's the opportunity to do something else. So here we are talking. I could be working, doing something else. You could be having an ice cream. But you made a decision to come here. I made a decision to come here. And understanding the importance of cost in the full sense, not just the out-of-pocket payment of money, is another crucial part of economics that doesn't come naturally to people. So these are actually three things that don't always come naturally: costs, incentives, and complexity, the role of markets. And all these things, to understand them and to be able to use them as a way of thinking, require practice, experiencing them, thinking about them, applications of these ideas to different areas of public policy and to different areas of human activity. And that, to me, is what economic education is about.
So let's give examples so people will deeply understand what we are talking about. Let's talk about the masks in Corona. In the beginning, the masks were very expensive, so legislators wanted to limit the price. Isn't it a good mandatory policy?
Well, it seems good, because it seems wrong to take advantage of someone who's in desperate need of something for their health, the mask, to have to pay a premium, a higher price for it. I think everybody could afford a mask, but it still was harder for poor people to afford them than it was for rich people. And so the argument was they should be a set price that's low. The same argument gets made about Uber, which is, not available here in Israel.
Unfortunately.
I think unfortunately, although we'll see how Uber goes. Uber's having some challenges these days around the world that are not related to Israel. But in places where Uber exists, when there's high demand, the prices are higher.
Let's say it rains.
It rains, or storms worse, or it's just rush hour, or there's a big conference in town, or whatever it is. In those times, the prices are higher, and people say that's not fair. You're taking advantage of people. You shouldn't profit from people's necessity in a crisis or a tragedy or a storm. And it's a lovely idea. You could argue that you should do that. The problem is, of course, is that it has a consequence. You have to ask, and then what? So you've made it cheaper for people to travel, and then what? And the answer is you've made it harder for people to travel at the same time, because even though it's cheaper, there are not going to be as many Uber drivers willing to drive when the price is low. And similarly, if I'm going to be producing masks on short notice, urgently, and I want to run my factory 24 hours a day and not just 8 hours a day like I have in the past, if I'm going to run my factory 24 hours a day, I'm going to need to do more maintenance. It's going to break more often. I need to pay my workers extra to get them to come at times of the day when it's not convenient for them. So I need to have a higher price to incentivize me, to give me the incentive to do these steps that actually are quite good for the world. Now, you'd say, yeah, but it's terrible. You're taking advantage of people. And you could argue that's true, but that's how you get more masks. So if you want more masks, you have to generally let the price rise. You could just beg. You could just plead. You could just implore. You could say, please, please work 24 hours a day. You, the worker, even though you're going to have to give up time away from your family to work a 16-hour shift instead of an 8-hour shift, don't you care about me? And the answer is some people do, and they might work that longer shift, but the price incentive is a very powerful way to unleash that willingness to work longer hours.
This is what Adam Smith said in the book from 1776, The Wealth of Nations.
Well, prices, incentives matter. People respond to incentives. Now, it's not the only way to get, as I said, to get people to change their behavior, but it's the most effective way that we've found in situations where strangers interact. Now, with my own family, I don't need to charge my children extra money when there's not enough cookies to go around for dessert. Let's say I have 4 children. So my wife and I are having dinner with their 4 children. There's 6 of us, and there's only 5 cookies. Should we sell it to the highest bidder?
Or one wants just the 5 cookies for
exactly.
himself.
Right, exactly. It might be the biggest one, the oldest one, the strongest one. And I'm going to intervene from the top down as a socialist dictator and say, sorry, we're going to share them equally. And if there aren't enough to go around, maybe I'll give one up. Or maybe the kid who had an ice cream an hour before dinner will go without a cookie tonight, and that would be okay too. But we make those decisions when we love each other in a very different way than when we're dealing with strangers. I give the example of one of my essays. There was a case in Sydney in Australia where there was a terrorist attack, and Uber prices went through the roof, meaning they went very, very high, and people were very upset. At that time, people were desperate to get out of the central part of town to the airport. They wanted to get out of town, and they thought people said it was unfair to have these high prices. And in some sense, they were right. It is unfair, but you get a lot of people willing to drive to head. Think about how crazy this is. What the price does is it gets people to head toward danger instead of running away from it. People want to run away from it. We want there to be people who head toward danger. Now, in the biggest sense of the word, we do the biggest sense of that concept. We do that with police, fire, the army, right? We pay them to head toward danger. That's part of the deal. We say to those people, we're going to pay you a certain amount of money, and you understand that there will be times when you will be asked to put your life at risk for the cause that we're working on together. That's a beautiful idea in a crisis. It doesn't work so well. Here's the deeper point about this. You have a crisis of this terrorist attack in Sydney. It's not just a question of getting people motivated to head toward danger, these drivers. They're people desperate to get out of this area. We pay a high price. They pay a high price through the Uber app to incentivize drivers to come and take care of them. It would be a beautiful thing if instead we just sent out a notice. There's danger. Please come help. And we do that in certain situations when there's a shortage of blood. Most countries don't pay people for extra blood. They beg, which is beautiful. People rise to the occasion. They come and they donate blood. But there's an extra piece of this. It's not just that it's motivating them, the higher price. It's informing them. There's an existing mechanism to tell them that suddenly there are people who desperately want their service. They don't know why. They don't know it's a terrorism attack. They don't know if it's just a big concert. They don't know if it's a sporting event. They just see that, and it's a little bit unfair to the drivers, by the way, because they might decide if they knew there was danger. But the point is that there's a mechanism to alert drivers built into that system, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. I write the example. I used to live in St. Louis, Missouri, in the middle of the United States. And there was a big flood. St. Louis is on the Mississippi River, big river. There's a big flood. And a lot of people lost their houses, had damage to their houses. And 3 months after that flood, I wanted to build a porch on my house, an extra piece to my house. So I got an estimate from carpenters and builders as to what it would cost, and it was about double what I thought it was going to be. And I thought, this is ridiculous. Why is it so expensive? I'm not going to do this now. I'm going to forget it. And what I was doing there, I didn't realize, because I'd forgotten, because my house was far away from the flood. I'd forgotten that there had been a flood 3 months before, and that there were people who desperately wanted builders and carpenters not to build a porch, but to rebuild their house. And so what that high price said to me was, don't build the porch. Now, if someone had said to me, I know you really want to build the porch, but my house got destroyed by the flood. Could you let me have the carpenter first? And I would have said yes. But that person had no way of finding me. What the high price did is it informed me that somebody wanted those builders more than I wanted them, and I let them have it. And that's a beautiful thing, because we forget sometimes that information is very scarce. One of the beautiful things about decentralized prices, the fact that prices steer resources without someone having to do it from the top down, from what we call command and control of an expert at the top deciding who should get what and when. Prices just say, well, it's up to you. You want it, you can have it. If you don't want it, you can do without it. That decentralized system of prices provides information. It's more than it provides information. It sends signals of information to people to behave as if they knew. Now, as if they knew. They don't know.
Yeah.
I didn't know I'd forgotten there was a flood.
Actually, in this story, it seems that you forgot two things. First, that there was a flood, and because of the flood, there is higher demand for carpenters. And second, that you were a professor of economics. Like
right.
those,
it did dawn on me eventually.
Intuitions are so hard to get rid of. Like the intuitions that we were born with. The Hayek says the family intuitions, because our family, the way it is built, the social structure of a family, of a close friendship, is so different than the social construct of a family, of a community of strangers, which this guy with the wrecked house couldn't talk to you. Even if he was talking to you, to Russ,
he couldn't
have talking to other people that wanted to build a
He'd
porch.
have to find every one of them. And I might have decided after I heard his story, I'm not such a nice person. I might decide, I appreciate your situation, but I think I want a porch really badly. I miss my porch. And so what the price system does is it pushes me aside. It tells without anyone having to find each other and go through this negotiation, it just gave him the porch, the carpenter, which meant he could have his house back before I got my porch, which is the right thing. Eventually I did build the porch. I built it about 2 years later when the demand for carpenters had gone down and for builders had gone down, and the price was much lower, and I got my porch then.
I remember on class that you were talking about this incident, and you were saying one more thing, which is really good, and I use it in class when I teach all the time. Sorry for stealing your ideas.
It's not stealing. It's not even borrowing. That's what's great about him. The ownership, we can both enjoy them at the same time.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Actually, you're glad that I'm stealing your ideas. So I remember that you were saying about, let's say that some commissar would lower the price in, what's the name of the city?
St. Louis.
In St. Louis. So carpenters from California wouldn't move to St. Louis for a few months, leave their family in order to supply a greater supply for the wrecked city. But if the prices would still be up as the market demand say they should be, so people from all around the United States would come to St. Louis because there's a higher demand for carpenters, and the tragedy would finish sooner. כמה מכם פנו אליי לגבי זה שהם עשו מנוי למידע, אבל לא קיבלו קישור לעל המשמעות פלוס. אז רציתי להבהיר את הדרגות של המנויים לאתר מידע. יש לנו מנוי ב-25 שקלים, המאפשר כניסה למפגש הזום השבועי ביום חמישי בשעה 9. מי שעושה מנוי ב-60 שקלים גם מקבל גישה לעל המשמעות פלוס. פודקאסט עם מעל 200 פרקים שאתם יכולים להאזין לו דרך נגן הפודקאסטים המועדף אליכם, ומי שעושה מנוי ב-120 שקלים גם חשוף לעל המשמעות פלוס, גם נכנס למפגשי הזום השבועיים, וגם חשוף לכל התוכן פרימיום שגדי טאוב ועקיבא ביגמן מפרסמים למנויים שלהם. אז אני כמובן ממליץ על 120 שקלים ואפילו יותר למי שיכול, כדי לעזור לנו להפיק את הפודקאסט ולהשפיע על חייהם של אלפי אנשים. תודה רבה.
Yeah, exactly. It's beautifully said. I'm so proud that you remember. It makes me so happy.
In Hebrew, it's much easier.
But it's a great, relevant, important point that it's not just determining the higher price doesn't just determine who gets the porch or the carpenter or the builder. It determines how many porches are available to be built, how many houses are available to be built, how many carpenters are there to help people. And it's, it's exactly right.
So let's talk a little bit about real estate and economics. I just came back a month ago from a trip to Los Angeles to my brother, which is working in the industry of real estate. I remember that all the buildings, or most of the buildings in Los Angeles are only 1 story high. And I used to ask my brother and his friends, why is it only 1 story high? So they say there are much earthquakes in Los Angeles, blah, blah, blah. So I asked them, but the buildings in downtown, there are 40 floors high. Don't they have earthquakes in downtown? So they were like scratching their heads, and it was like the guy who learned some economics with people that just heard rumors and stories. Even they live in the cities more than me. I was there only for 2 days until I was starting to asking those questions. And the building in LA are really old. Nobody rebuilding the house and tearing it down and rebuilding it all apart. And the economics is the answer. Why didn't it happen? And also in Israel, we have a very high price of housing in Israel, if you compare it to the United States, for sure. And people don't really understand why the price is being so high. It's
because of greedy real estate owners, right? Yeah. Greedy landlords, people want to make a lot of money, and builders. I don't think that's the reason. That was not, it was, we say in English, tongue-in-cheek, meaning a joke.
Betzinut.
Betzinut?
Betzini.
But seriously, there are a lot of reasons why real estate is expensive in Israel. Some of it is on the demand side. The fact that there are a lot of people moving to Israel from around the world,
like you,
like me. I played my small role in pushing up the price of rental units here for this year.
Shame on you.
Yeah, shame on me. Fortunately, I'm small. My wife and I are renting 1 apartment, so our impact is small. But it's a very important point. As hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people try to do that, the price will start to rise. So the demand is part of it, but it's not the whole story. The other side, of course, is the supply. And in Israel, I don't understand yet the full range of restrictions on real estate and supply, but certainly they are part of the problem for why it's expensive to live in Tel Aviv, in particular, say, or Yerushalayim. And just take one example. Maybe you know the details better than I do because I'm a newcomer, but...
Yeah, but we can talk about New York, we can talk about Los Angeles,
right,
we can talk about any big city.
By the way, they're also expensive, and so the bigger cities in America I know a little bit more about, but the part in Israel that I wanted to highlight is that it takes a long time to get permission to build here. So I was talking to someone about this, and they said, but look around. You can look around Yerushalayim. There's cranes everywhere. There's building everywhere. Every corner, there's a new apartment going up. The question is, when did it start? When did the owner of that property start to try to build on that space? And when it takes, I'm told it takes many years. Is that correct?
Yeah, sometimes 20 years.
Well, I heard 7 or 8. I don't want to exaggerate, but if it's sometimes 20, what that means is that's 10, 28, whatever it is, years where you have no revenue. And so to recover your investment, you're going to have to get a higher price, meaning the price is going to be higher to get people to be willing to take those risks and build in those places. Now, in other cities where I know a little bit more about the regulatory environment, the regulations that are on housing, to take New York, for example, first of all, they also have the same issue about the heights of the buildings. There are certain parts of New York where the buildings are really high, and there are other parts in Manhattan where they're not high. How could that be? And they make the same story you just told about Los Angeles. They say, well, the ground, the foundation, the granite underneath the city in those places are different. And it is a little different. It's not a ridiculous story. It's just not it's not the relevant part. The relevant part is that there's special taxes on how high a building how special taxes depending on the height of the building and how far away from the street it is. And that has discouraged certain parts of the city from having taller buildings. Usually when land is expensive, you build high. And of course, what's amazing about that is that a high building is a way of getting more land. You think, well, the land area of Tel Aviv is fixed. So of course, as demand increases, of course the price has to go up, but it's not true. In many parts of the world, through much of human history, even though demand was rising, the prices don't rise so much because people can build higher. They can build a little farther away. But what's happened in cities like New York and other places, besides the taxes, there's also the fact that they require, and this is such a tragedy, they require an apartment to be a certain minimum size. You think, well, that's nice. Isn't that nice? That way everyone will have enough room to live. The problem with that is...
enough windows.
What?
To have enough windows.
Windows, of course.
To have an elevator.
Everything should be...
parking. In Israel, parking is compulsory for every new building.
Yeah, and I think that's a mistake. I have a recent episode with Donald Shoup on that in EconTalk, because what that does is it for people who don't have a car, or for places where you'd like to have fewer cars in the whole area, what you've done is you've taxed the creation of new buildings, which means that you've forced the owners, in order to recoup their investment, to charge more than they otherwise would. So in case of the minimum size, there might be people, often there are, who are young, poor, for whatever reason, they're willing to live in a small apartment in return to live in a very exciting place where they can get a great job or have a great experience living with other people in the city that's alive and vibrant, which would be true of Tel Aviv, which would be true of New York and other great cities. And what you've said is you can't have that choice. You can only live in an apartment that has a certain minimum size. And once you do that, of course, there aren't going to be any inexpensive options on the market. And people then say, oh, look at that, we need more affordable housing. They forget the fact that the affordable housing has been priced out of the market by the regulation. You don't need to have special laws limiting rents. You don't need to have special laws subsidizing buyers, both of which effectively raise the price of housing against what you want to achieve. What you need is to allow certain options to be available for people who, at this point in their life, are willing to exchange size for a great location. And what you do is when you have a minimum size of a certain amount, you're basically saying to them, you can only afford to live here if you live far away. You have to have a longer commute. You have to, it's not...
You have to stand in traffic
yeah.
and stuff like that. But the first factor you were talking about is the years that it takes for someone to get a permit. But let's talk about the bigger picture. The bigger picture is a permit is needed because if someone has a land in a city, if he builds 10 stories high or 40 stories high, he externalizes some of the effects of the building to his neighbors. It meaning that if you build really high, you block the view for your neighbor, you block the sun, you make much more traffic in the roads, you make the sewer have to be bigger. So there has to be a department or va'ada, some kind of a body of really best professionals who could argue and decide about if your building should be 10 or 40 stories high?
Well, let's see. If we have 3 or 4 more hours, we could talk about those issues. So it's a very complicated question, but I'll say 2 things. One is that you're right. When I build my building, I have impact on people around me. The question then is, how can we make that process work well in general? This is an area where the economist Ronald Coase, C-O-A-S-E, Ronald Coase has written profoundly interesting things about externalities. But you could argue, and many people do, that we do need a VOD. We need a commission. We need a place where experts can decide what is best when people's desires conflict. Okay. The problem is that in history, at least in the United States, the situation I know a little bit better, but I suspect it's the same here. Those bodies don't really necessarily work for the people in general. They often tend to work for the rich, the powerful, the people who already live there, already have the building.
Vatikim, the people that already have housing, the neighbors, meaning, instead of the right of property, it's a right of who came first.
Right. Right, which is not ideal. So it's very important to point this out. Both of those solutions, the VOD or the unconstrained market where you can build whatever you want and of any size, they're both imperfect. They both have problems. The question is, which is better? They're both flawed. I recently had Mike Munger on the program on EconTalk on my podcast to talk about this issue. He says something I love. He's actually adapting an idea from Harold Demsetz.
It's about real estate or about the general idea?
It's about the general idea of when we have two policy options, the market, say, or a commission, which is better? And he said, we often fall victim to what he calls the prettiest pig. So most pigs are ugly. So let's say we have a contest. We're going to see which pig is the prettiest. We have two contests, two contestants, two participants in the contest. So they bring out the first pig. It's hideous. It is so ugly. The judges say, this pig is so ugly, we're going to give the prize of the prettiest pig to the second pig. But you haven't seen it yet. Oh, I don't need to. This pig, it couldn't be uglier than this one. But of course it could be. Pigs are generally kind of ugly. So when we have a choice between what we might call a market solution or a government solution, people say, well, look at the market solution. It's terrible. They block the sun for these people. They impose costs of congestion. Then they say, well, so we should need a commission. But you'd also need to see how the commission turns out. It also has some problems. It tends to favor the existing landowners. It's captured politically by the people who have the biggest stake in it and spend the most time on it, etc. So you want to look at both solutions because they're both imperfect. They're both ugly, like pigs.
So we'll take your recommendation of the Mike Munger episode with you on EconTalk and the cause theorem, which we need to read. Thank you very much, Professor Roberts.
Thank you so much, Tamir. Great talking to you.
על המשמעות, פודקאסט פילוסופי פוליטי.